All right. All right, we're recording. It's October 25. We've got lots to get through today. But first off, we've got Nick to talk about conformance. So let's hand it off to Nick.
Yep, cool. Okay, so I wanted to level set a bit with this first bit, as I think it's easy for us to just start using the word without making sure that we're all on the same page. So yeah, I think that the important parts of conformance, at the end of the day, the most important reason to do conformance on the Gateway API is that one of the big deliverables we want here is to be able to move between Gateway API implementations. And if we don't have a standard way to do conformance, then people are not going to be able to do that, because people are going to implement things in different ways. And so if we want people to be able to, we want to meet this sort of cross-migration goal, then we got to have really good conformance, and we got to have really clear, easy to do and easy to understand conformance. So that's sort of, and when I'm talking about conformance here, I think there's three parts to conformance. There's the definition of what conformance actually is, like what is it for something to be a conformant implementation of the Gateway API. So a set of tests that validate that you are conformant to the thing that we defined in step one, and then a process by which you can submit your data somewhere and have a canonical representation of that data, so that there's a place where you can say what are the canonical, the conformant implementations of the Gateway API. There's a corollary across all four of those things that we need to talk about later, about how we handle versioning, and how we say, like, because for the upstream Kubernetes APIs, implementations have to re-certify for each Kubernetes version, right? You are conformant for a particular Kubernetes version. You got to retest and resubmit. Most people don't normally put the version on the thing, but you actually have to redo it for every version. So I think we're probably going to need to do something similar, that when we cut a version, you're going to need to resubmit your tests. There are corollaries there that probably we need to, the testing and the conformance profiles will all be included as part of the release of the Gateway API. I wanted to stop there and say, is any of what I just said controversial? Doesn't feel like it would be, but no.
Lines up with what I thought. Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Okay. Good. Yeah. So let's scroll it down a bit, Rob. I think I covered these few things. So yeah, I think that we need, so the things, so if you want to scroll back up a little bit, yeah, I just want to cover the scope things here. So I think that we've talked a bit about how there are different implementations of the Gateway API, and I think the absolute must-have is that there's some way to have different types of conformance for different implementations. At a minimum, I think there needs to be layer 4 and layer 7 sort of conformance profiles. So, layer 7 is your typical ingress controller that handles layer 7, HTTP, HTTPS, TLS stuff. And then layer 4 is the stuff that handles the somewhat at the moment poorly defined TCP and UDP, and maybe TLS stuff. I think I discussed this a little bit further down. But the other things that we need to do are we need to make sure that there's a way in the conformance testing and the conformance profiles to define, like, to use the support levels that we've already defined in the API. There needs to be a way that you can validate that your thing supports core, the core, the extended, and the implementation specific stuff. And there needs to be ways that that we validate all of those things. For extended features in particular, I think this is really interesting, because extended features, you don't have to support them, but if you do, there are behaviors that you must support. And so that says to me that we need to have conformance tests upstream for those extended features that are conditionally enabled if you say that you want to support those things. So exactly how we do that, I think that's the part that I want to talk about in the proposal. And then the last thing is obviously the testing suite there. And I think one of the things that would be really nice to have is that there's some way to do this that means that you don't have to go out to some external website to find out if your thing is supported or not. Then that would be really nice. Sorry, I didn't see what you added there, Harry.
So what happened? Like, we'll have to figure out like a balance where, let's say, an implementation only supports 4 out of 40 extended features. Like, there are a lot of those intricacies in extended feature set in the API.
Yeah. So I think that probably the extended feature stuff is going to need a few passes to get it exactly right. But that's one of the things I wanted to talk about in the proposal, is exactly how we make that work. So let's go down and let's talk about the actual. So before we do that, it feels like there doesn't seem to be anybody's not shouting at me saying that's a terrible idea.
So I guess my question is, how does this align with the the overall Kubernetes conformance? Is it basically the same thing, or are we doing something different here?
I think the sort of the three phases that I talked about are the same as the upstream, from what I understand. There's, you define a profile, you provide testing for the profile, and then you provide a way to submit data. That is based on what I believe the upstream wanted to be. I haven't touched it in a while, so maybe I'm out of date there, but.
Okay, I'm just curious of like if we.
Yeah,
if it's
definitely
exactly the same, or like we have to do something unique for ourselves.
I think the thing that we have to do that's unique is having very clearly defined profiles, and having the different support levels for different features. Those things are unique to us, and so we're going to have unique ways to handle doing them.
I see. Got it.
Yeah. But so I think the sort of the broader strokes profile we should just lift from upstream, and that's what I have just assumed that we have done that in the rest of this. I'm talking about in the rest of this. I'm sort of assuming that we're going to stick with, that we define the profiles, we have tests for the profiles, we have a way to submit the data back, and that all of the rest of this is talking about how do we define the profiles, what sort of tests do we run, how do we handle our specific things like extended fields, and I have hand waved the how do we get the data back for now, because all of that is dependent on exactly what we do in the first two steps. Okay,
I think does it upstream? Do they just like submit like some markdown file or something?
I think it's actually like a JUnit test file or something like that. That's the output of Sonoboy. Yeah, basically you take Sonoboy and you output, you send a PR to a specific repo with that output, and then someone checks that the output does what it says or something like that. Then yeah, thank you. Thanks, James. Yeah. It's been a little while since I looked at this, but the last time that I did, yeah, you run the Sonoboy tests, and then you get the output, and then you send a PR.
Got it.
So, yeah, I think something like that is what we will need. But exactly how we end up doing that depends on what we end up using as a test framework, and what the output of that test framework is and stuff like that. So I kind of went, that's future us's problem. We've got other problems right now. So I think, so I think we should have just the two conformance profiles to begin with. We need to ensure that when we're doing the conformance profile, mechanics, that we have a way to add more later that may be a superset or a partial set of what we have already, but basically we just need a way to extensively add that without having to substantially change the mechanisms we're using. I think that we should define, it seems to me to make sense that the sort of the core conformance for each layer means for the objects that fit into that conformance profile, that's the support for the core fields and the core functionality of those things. And we treat that like a Docker tag, in that like a container image tag, in that the core conformance tests is actually like a manifest for a certain set of tests to be run against a cluster. But we kind of don't want to be too specific about that for the core conformance, because we want to be able to bump that on a version basis and just say core conformance. So we want to treat that a little bit like a tag in Git or in a container that we say, okay, version 0.5.0 of the API, we've issued core conformance for the layer 7 conformance profile and the layer 4 conformance profile, and there's just a boolean that says layer 7 support true, and that includes some set of tests that you can go and look at if you really want to, but it doesn't. The end user should not really care. They should just care that it does everything you would expect it to do. That's labeled as core conformance, right? And the exact set of tests does not matter. However, that's kind of syntactic sugar for the underlying mechanisms, and we want to expose those underlying mechanisms a little bit more in the case of the extended features. And so I'll get to that in a sec. But so that's what I think that's what I think the core conformance profile should mean, is it's like a shorthand for this is the set of tests that you run to validate that. And so when we do that, yeah, like I said there, we need to version the conformance profiles and include both them and the tests in the release. So when we cut a version, it will include the conformance profile, like the set of tests that we should run, like the list of tests that we should run, and then the tests themselves. They are
That's an interesting question, is whether they should live separately or with releases.
So,
which is like Kubernetes EDB, I think, lives with Kubernetes, but then you can sort of see like a reason to have it live separately.
Absolutely. I think regardless of where the code lives, the releases have to be in lockstep, right? Like and so if you have the code live somewhere else, you actually have a coordination problem that when you cut a release in the actual API repo, you also have to cut a release in the testing repo. So it probably makes more sense to just put it all in one thing, because it's much easier there's less coordination overhead, and it's easier to test and stuff when you know that everything is at the same level. How do you test the tests? And who will police the police, right? Like, how far down do you go on that rabbit hole? So I think I think we need to version them and include them. They need to be versioned and released at the same time, is my proposal. And also, the other thing that's important to note here is, I think I said it before, but the conformance profiles in general should be composable. Like, you should be able to support multiple, like you should be able to say, I support layer 4 and layer 7, or I support some other set of conformance profiles, and they should not necessarily be mutually exclusive. Like, you should be able to, there may be shared tests between different conformance profiles, but they should not necessarily be like, you can only support one. That's what I'm trying to say with that. You should be able to support multiple conformance profiles. Okay, and then so I just went through and sort of marked out some quick, really, really basic stuff. I'm 100% open to changing the names here, but I've kept it the most descriptive name I could think of, just layer 7 and layer 4. If we can come up with better names than that, I'd be very happy to. I think that TLS route in particular does not fit cleanly into layer 4 or layer 7, because TLS does not fit cleanly into the OSI model. But it's kind of a good enough substitute to start talking about it. And I would be definitely interested in having people tell me other names.
Yeah, this is like a bike chatting thing, but probably another alternative is like HTTP versus. Anyways, we can talk forever on this. I don't want to get stuck on it. Yeah. Like, that's what I kind of just, again, this was a hand wavy thing. I'm like, it's going to be something like this. It's not worth worrying about it for now. The important part is like what we're actually talking about here, which is the layer 7 one means that you support gateway class, gateway. So gateway class and gateway, you have to support by every single conformance profile, right? I don't think that should be very controversial. Gateway is the key object for this whole API. What we're really talking about in terms of conformance profiles is what extra routes you support and what features you support inside those routes. And so layer 7 is HTTP route and TLS route. You have to support all of the fields marked core in all 4 of those objects. And then you may support field marks extended or implementation specific. Similarly for layer 4, that's gateway class, gateway, TCP route, UDP route. One of the things that I think, the more I've talked about the gateway API, the more I think that there are definite use cases for using that, where you could use the gateway API as we have constructed it to describe things like VPN tunnels, GRE tunnels, stuff like that, where you're talking about actually layer 3 or other constructs lower than layer 4. So that's one of the reasons I've left this pretty open, that I don't want to rule out adding stuff for that later with the way that we talk about this. So in each case though, the conformance profile says you've got to support all the fields marked core, and you may support the extended fields. So how do we know what extended fields you support? Well, the contention I make is that we should just put that in the gateway class status. It should be the responsibility of a controller to write a stanza to the gateway class status that describes the conformance profile that the controller meets in terms of both its core support and its extended support. The exact mechanics of how we specify the extended support, it's pretty complicated. I think we're going to need to go back and forth on it a lot. What I wanted to get to today was agreement that sort of broad strokes approach was the way to go. Then we can get into detail at a later date about exactly how we would do that. Yeah, I was of the opinion that I'm not as certain that we actually need to throw this into status, but because it almost seems like something that exists on the back of the box, going back to the time when software is shipped in paper boxes, but would not just be omnipresent when the user's actually using it.
So the reason I wanted to put it on the gateway class is that in my mind, there's a strong tie. It's not a one-to-one mapping, but it's close to one-to-one between a gateway class and an implementation. You know, like every gateway class must have an implementation, not, you know, one implementation may have more than one gateway class. But because for every gateway class, it's going to be, it's the gateway class that tells you what the gateways under that support. And so that's why, in my mind, the gateway class is the right place to put this information, because it means that you don't have to, I think the really good thing you get out of this is you don't have to run off to some website to look at the back of the box. The back of the box is like included in the box. Hang on.
Yeah, the trick here though is the vocabulary, right? Because this goes back to like the feature tags or whatever the terminology we used before discussion, right? Because basically, I don't know if it, I don't think that you programmatically want to know, does it support this conformance thing? You probably need to know more granular detail than that.
Also, yeah, so I think programmatic, that's why I kind of wanted to make it that. So if you scroll down a little bit, I had a couple of ideas here that, we've got, sorry, actually just up a little bit. I've sort of put a summary of the things I think we should do. Just that bulleted list. Thanks, Rob. We have a small number of profiles that are effectively syntactic sugar for a certain set of tests. So I think that's the key part, James, that, that's what I meant by like, it's like a container image tag or a Git tag that, there's two fields really that are important. There's a version field somewhere and a do I support this conformance profile field. And those two things let you know the features that are included. And so you can make an assumption as a user based on the version, what stuff is included. And as a tool consuming this information, you can pull the API spec, the objects and all that sort of stuff. And presumably we would need to have a manifest somewhere of the exact stuff that's included somehow. Again, there's a lot to hand wave there, but like the idea here is that the core conformance profile should be like the stuff that you would expect that to do. And then the interesting part is the extended features, where it's like, do you support this extended feature? And if so, here's the ways that you have to do it. And so I think that
I agree with there should be an easy way that's programmatically consumable for someone to understand a given implementation, which extended things it supports. It's still a little hazy to me. We need to necessarily have it in like a very Kubernetes native online format, because it feels like that has less use cases, although it sounds useful in very niche circumstances. One observation, I don't know if you agree with this, is that might just be a longer discussion, but we can move on the rest of the conformance without having fully resolved it. Is that accurate?
Yeah. So I think if you agree that we need to have a way to record that you support the core conformance for a specific version, and some way that for you to record what extended features you support, I think those are the two main contentions. The idea that it has to be on the status it doesn't have to be, but I wanted to use that as a way to discuss some of the things that come up about the way that we handle this information, because no matter how we do it, it needs to be machine consumable.
That's right.
And it needs to be, it needs to be machine consumable somehow, so that, because if nothing else, it'd be really handy for the testing to be able to look at something, to know what it's testing, like what controller it's testing and what tests it should run, right? Like, and so then you can have a single test harness that supports all of the different things, that picks the test manifest based by looking at something. If that something is the gateway class, then you don't have to go to reach out to another site. You have to talk to the Kubernetes gateway API, the Kubernetes API server already. that lets you go to one place as for the testing thing, and then putting that stuff on the gateway class status lets users use that as a way to say, what is this? I've just installed this implementation in my cluster. Can I move my UDP routes to it? And you look at the gateway class and be like, oh no, I can't. Hopefully you've figured that out already, but it means there's like a single place that's easy to understand that you go to. You don't have to go and look up the project's website or something like that, or go to its GitHub repo to pull down a manifest file that describes this support. It's all right there, and it's described in a standard way. And that's why I think the status that's why I was pushing for the status, is that you get an easy win for the testing framework, but then it's useful for other people as well. So I 100% agree that this is definitely up for discussion, and I've kind of gone a little deep in this thing here to sort of try and draw out some other discussions that I think are also interesting. So I'd like you all to just, for now, live in a world where we've accepted that, yeah, sure, we're going to write some status, although we haven't. Let's talk about, if we did write status, what sort of things that would look like. I put the obvious, most naive way I could think of, which is basically, some Booleans plus annotations, which I think is a terrible idea, but I wanted to put it in here for completeness. Is, if you scroll down a little bit, basically we just add a stanza that's like, for each profile, you have a thing that's like supported false or true, and then a map string bool of fields of extended features that you support. Obviously, the risks here are, this is an anti-pattern. It's like annotations, which is a bad idea. How do you name the extended field supports? How does that describe like what the actual extended fields do? You can't do domain prefixing. So there's no way for you to like slide in implementation specific features into this at all. Versioning is really coarse, and it's difficult to add extra conformance profiles because it's not a list or something else that you can add to. It's like it's an actual field. So I kind of wanted to add this as the straw man to be like, this is something we could do, but I don't think it's a good idea. I think that we should steal from conditions API here, that we should be looking at adding lists of structured objects to describe each of the things we want to describe. So I think that in this one, if you look, let's skip past the conditions and stuff for the moment, Rob, and just show it, and I'll talk through the actual example. The idea here is there's a list of profiles that are structured data about the conformance profiles that you support, which just have a small amount of information, like do you support it and what version are you talking about if you do. Probably some of these could be optional and stuff like that, but the idea here, the key here is that the profiles are a list, that they are a structured object, the same as you would add for other Kubernetes structured objects. And then more importantly, the features are also a list, and they are also a structured object. So, and that structured object can have information about what the name of the feature that you're talking about is, that it's extended support, or it could be, maybe you want to describe your implementation specific things in here. That seems like it would be really useful for implementation to be able to say, here's some of the names of the features that we support that no one else does, the implementation specific ones, but here's the thing. I put in like a field spec there because that feels like a JSON path kind of thing to say, this is the thing that I'm talking about. You can go and look at the spec and see the things, and find the definition of the thing that I'm talking about. So a lot of this is 100% up for negotiation, but I think the two key things that I've put in this idea are that the things are lists of the things are lists of structured data. The profiles and features have their own sort of separate things, and the profiles are like again a syntactic sugar for a certain set of core features. So theoretically, you could describe these as a huge list of features and not have the profiles, but the profiles are useful because those are the things that everybody has to do. So yeah, I think those are sort of the key things that I'm contending here, is that if you're going to put it on the status, then it makes sense to do something like conditions where you've got a list of structured data, and that structured data should easily be easily extensible, but at the same time be useful for both for the testing, but also for people to look at and understand what is my gateway implementation actually doing. If you could just scroll back up a little bit, Rob, to those bulleted lists. Yeah, so I just want to make sure I haven't missed anything. So yeah, I think if we did it this way, then you can do versioning for both profiles. you can version profiles, but you can also version like your field support. So you can have implementation specific fields that you care about, no one else does. Having the actual explicit field, like the fields be really explicit, I think is a good thing. It makes it very clear exactly what extended fields you're doing. That kind of solves the how do you know what extended features you support problem, Harry. But I think you run the risk. The downside of that is you run the risk of the object getting too big. If there's a lot of extended features, that's a big risk. And having field spec and field spec and stuff like that seems a bit risky, that it might change too much or something like that. I don't know. This was kind of like a very early, like, here's something I think might work, with the intent that we all find all the problems in it and we don't end up doing this. But like, I wanted to have something to talk about so that we're not just bike shedding, that we have actually a concrete proposal to react to. So with that, I'm going to stop talking.
So I think this looks like a reasonable, if we put it in the status and we can continue to discuss what it looks like. My concern that we have to answer is, how do we, let's say we want to do this, how do we start saying this is an extended feature, giving it I guess a short name, and then describing what is inside it. And then the other one is, if we are going to link it to either the API types comments or documentation that's in text somewhere on the website, how do we keep all that stuff consistent when we're writing this?
I think this really complements the notes we had earlier around conformance too, and like the questions you were saying, Bowie, about how we assign short names to features. I mean, that's similar to the doc we had, right? Of like, every conformance test needs to have a short name that we can link to, and this is a slightly different take on it, but it is the idea that as we build on this API, every feature we're adding probably does need some kind of short name.
And the question would be like, then it's like a classification, like then unfortunately it's a bit fuzzy. It's like, is it one short name or is it like 3 short names because they're like 3 different smaller features and I think that's going to take up the bulk of our effort, to simply just write it down and organize it.
Yeah, I think that comes back to what James said about classification and taxonomy, right? Like, the large part of the effort in actually doing this is just going to be going through and classifying everything into, where we've marked as extended, where we marked a field as extended support, then that's when we have to make it, then we have to give it a name. We've marked it as core support. It also has to have a name, because the core support, like the point of what I was showing there is that you don't want the end user to have to give a shit about the what's in the core support, right? Like you want them to be like, hey, I've got core support for layer 7 that lets me do all the stuff I expect to do for layer 7. We worry about that, right? But for us to worry about that, we have to have a list of a manifest of the tests that you run to do that, and those manifest of tests need to be like, we test your hostname support. That it does, we have 3 tests against your hostname support or something like that. Are those 3 tests all covered by in the hostname field, or do we have like individual names for each of the tests or something like that, right? The choice we make doesn't matter. We just have to make a choice.
Yeah, I'm curious about how we're going to tackle that, because it seems like we both need to reference the fact that we went through all the API type documentation and field documentation and basically have like, okay, we've had this test and it basically points here. And then the same thing with just the pros documentation. I think we actually have like a whole bunch of behavior that's on the website that technically like should be conformanceized somehow.
Yep. Yeah, and this was not intending to sort of make it that we don't need to do that work. We absolutely do need to do that work. What I was trying to do with this proposal was sort of say, let's build the background to why we do that work, so that when we do that work, we're all thinking about it in the same way, we're all aiming towards the same thing, and we end up in the same place. That way we can break the work down into chunks and have different people work on it. And it's not one person slaving away building this thing from scratch.
Right, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I do think though that we do have our work cut out for us probably in that
absolutely.
classification. So I'm curious how people think we should be tackling it.
I mean, when I've thought about conformance, I think it's important to have a very clear plan for how we do conformance testing for extended features. But we need to have some conformance testing, and the easiest place to get to for conformance testing is core features. So if we can just do core features, I think this idea of profiles, start with L4, L7, and do, focus on getting some conformance tests out the door that cover those core features, we're going to be a lot further ahead than if we get too far down into the weeds of extended features. Like we need to have a plan for them. And it's good to have this discussion and keep on going with it. But I think we have a lot of clear path ahead for conformance testing for that kind of core. And I think that is probably the most important starting point for me, at least.
Yeah, did we figure out, for example, what we have to produce some software artifact, like what the structure of that software artifact is?
Yeah, I think our doc probably covers a theoretical structure more closely, and this is covering more what we're testing, whereas the other doc is how the test would be structured. And I think we can merge those two concepts together pretty nicely. But I don't know that we have, until it's a gap, or I think a gap is the sensible next step for this. But until it's a gap, we don't technically have, consensus on any of these things.
I think the question I was trying to ask with a lot of what I put in this document is like, do we all agree on sort of the fundamental sort of bits of this, right? Like, yeah, like
I think this is about what and why of conformance, and we got stuck in a little bit of how, but I think that's what Nick is focusing on. We should have like a gap on what and why we conformance test, and that's it. Like, and not get into implementations, and that is, in my opinion, I think that removes the probability that reduces the probability of confusion.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay, so maybe my next action here is to take this bit, like the sort of the top bits of this and lift them out and put them into a gap that's like, so we're going to do conformance. We're going to do conformance profiles. Conformance, we're going to have conformance profiles are going to be like syntactic sugar for a set of core conformance tests that cover the features that are marked core in the objects. Here's rough. So, and basically, so Rob, if you scroll a bit further up, if we sort of go up to basically we sort of put it up to, I cut it off at conformance information in gateway status. We don't put that in, but like the rest of it is basically the get, like that we have two conformance profiles, that the conformance profiles are defined in like terms of what routes you support is really what the conformance profile is. So I can probably even cut this down a little bit to just be like, what routes do you support? And then in those routes, core conformance is supporting all of the core fields. And then that then lets us build the framework for how we talk about building out the set of core tests for the core fields. The stuff that I said about the status and stuff, yes, I agree, John, that it's nice to have, but like it's not important to start with. The most important thing is to have some tests that let you validate the core conformance. But I did want to mention some of that in that I do think that having something visible on status, it just makes it so much easier to use. That's my feeling. It is not important for now though. So I'll write a gap that's like basically just the top part of this document, so that we can say this is what we're going to do. This is what our plan is for conformance testing in general and for conformance profiles. And I'll put in there, I don't think I've been explicit enough in there that there's sort of three parts of the conformance regime, the profiles, the profile definitions, the testing code to do them, and the process by which you submit that data somewhere to have your implementation registered canonically as a conformant implementation. And so those are, I think, the three things that this should cover, that's the way that we want things to work, and that the conformance profile will be core support based on the objects that you support, and that there will be two initially. I think all of those things were relatively not contentious. Does that make sense?
Yep. That makes great sense to me. I'm excited to get a gap like this in.
Yeah, and I think then that lets us make sure that we're all on the same page, that as we go into looking into building out the tests, that we know where we're going. And I'll put down the bottom that here's the problems that we've got that we know we have to solve.
Yep.
How do we version them? How do we handle the extended and implementation specific support types? Those sort of things.
Cool. Awesome. Anything else to say on conformance? I think we're at a good point here. Should we move on to other items on the agenda, or any other questions, topics, concerns? Okay, awesome. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for getting this together, Nick. This is great. Excited to have a better vision for what conformance profiles will be. Yeah, all right, let me move on. I have a proposal here that is a proposal, to be clear. I called it a plan in the doc, but that is very much an ambitious title, and this is an ambitious timeline. But based on our call last week, we discussed, okay, how soon can we get V1 beta 1 out? How soon can we actually graduate to beta? And at the same time, we were discussing, hey, let's talk about these features that we, missed the cut for V1 Alpha 2, but we said, okay, well, we'll do that in the next release after V1 Alpha 2. So we have these two kind of seemingly conflicting ideas here, right? We have this idea of we want to add these cool new features that we've been talking about for a while now, but we also want to get to beta because, it's easier to launch products, support, etc., when you at least have a beta API to work with. So trying to combine those two concepts, I wanted to run through how we could potentially make this all work. Some of the context that's missing here, I mentioned it in Slack, but I brought up the idea of experimental fields to API machinery at the meeting last week and in the mailing list. I was expecting it to be a highly controversial topic. It was not. It was around a 5-minute discussion item. That the proposal was great, so yay, I guess. But the idea of releasing a separate experimental track of CRDs was actually well received and seemed like the way to do it. So, yay.
Yeah, I think, Rob, I know we discussed like after that meeting, is this going to be in some form that is easily digestible by the community in general? Because I don't like even us like discussing this with the CRD maintainers, it wasn't very obvious that this was indeed a thing that was needed. And then after going through it a lot more, it was, oh yeah, this is a missing like CRD best practice or something.
I think for better or for worse, a lot of projects are looking at what we're doing as a reference point for how they'll be handling CRDs. So I think we need to do a good job at documenting our plans and how we got to these plans, the discussions with API machinery and whatnot. But I don't know if there's any great upstream documentation for that, which would be great to fix, but we can fix our side by at least making sure our plans are well documented. Which since this is a discussion topic that I kind of started and that I don't mind being the one to actually document that. But yeah, that's a good point. I think we need to make it pretty clear. And if you're not paying really close attention to this project, that's one aspect that would be very easy to miss.
I feel like, that one's also like a gap, a bit like what the conformance profiles one, that's like this is our sort of stance and plan. Like it's not a immediately implementable gap, but it's a gap to explain what we're doing, why we're doing it, why we think it's even a problem. Hey, we've thought about this and realize this is a problem that you haven't run into yet, but trust us, you will. This is the solution that we're proposing. And so that we all have a chance to understand, because I think I've spent some time thinking about this as well. I've talked to you about it, but I don't know if everyone on this call has spent any time thinking about what happens when you try to have, like, if you have the same object, the same object by every way that Kubernetes knows, like if the GVK is the same, but there are different schemas available. How does something know, what's the discriminator that you use to tell that you should be checking a schema, and how do you safely know what version of things that you're using, and how do you safely add fields to a GA API when you don't have like a feature gate mechanism enabled to say these fields should be present or not, and when you're also coordinating other separate software projects that are not all under one roof. Huge problem. But I think we actually have a pretty good solution, but we need to make sure we have all that context outlined in a GEP or something.
Yep. Completely agree. Yeah, let me work on a GEP for that one. So that actually set us up well. At the same time, I was thinking about beta, got some more clarity on exactly how we should handle experimental fields. And it sounds like, and this is my take on it, that it is possible to add new features in the same release we release beta if those new features are considered part of the experimental track of the API and therefore not on by default. It's basically feature gated, hidden away from the rest, but we're adding them. They're just being added to this experimental track. So as we graduate to beta, what we're saying is we're graduating this core set of functionality, which is likely identical to V1 Alpha 2, unless we get any significant feedback. And at the same time, we're adding this new concept of experimental fields, and we're starting with these. These may go away, or these may graduate to beta. We're not sure yet, but they're starting in this different world. So that's the high-level summary of how I think we can do this in a relatively short time frame. I can dig through the doc a little bit more to actually go into timeline and how this could actually work. But just to frame everything, that's how I'm approaching this. Does that seem like a reasonable approach to take for our next release? Any hesitation?
So we're thinking these features that would be experimental and beta, they would be part of the GA, but not as experimental when we go to the GA release. Yeah,
so that's a good question. I think how we've defined experimental, and this GEP list will need a GEP, but the way the existing doc defines experimental is these are features that can be removed or graduated in a following release. So they can stay in experimental, they can graduate, or they can go away. So I would hope that everything we add graduates, but no guarantees, right? So experimental is very much the definition of use at your own risk. We have this concept in upstream Kubernetes, they're feature gated fields, right? So they'll start as alpha and then graduate on through, or in some cases disappear.
I think it's pretty important to call out though that these will be experimental fields on the beta object, right? And so in the same way that right now, if you want to add something to the ingress object in Kubernetes, the ingress object is a GA object. So the object itself is GA, but you can add a new field in like a experimental way using a feature gate on the API server. So you can have a feature gate that's like ingress new field, true. And then when you do that, the API server will add that new field into its consideration of the thing. Functionally, by the API server, the backend storage thing has regardless of whether or not you're using it, has the field available, right? But then you just write information into it or get data out of it based on the presence of the flag. What we're talking about here is that the experimental track of the CRDs will basically, it's actually going to be a little funky to figure out exactly how we make this work properly with the API server, but it's going to have the extra fields available in the schema of the object, which will be the same GVK as the stable one, but there will need to be additional discriminators added. We've talked about annotations for now, but Rob and I talked about maybe promoting this to a field later for a CRD that sort of gives you a schema version that lets you sort of add extra fields that would then be stored in the underlying representation on the API server, and then is kind of, we're kind of grafting an extra version field on top of the existing version field, right? Like, and with all of the shenanigans that implies, because there's a lot of shenanigans involved in maintaining the version field out of the GVK for any given Kubernetes version. Like there's a storage version and a presentation version, and the API server can transparently convert between things, and it's okay to add new fields as long as they're nillable and there's a certain set of behaviors that are added that the upstream API machinery folk all know, but like this is us sort of trying to pull all the stuff that the upstream API machinery folk have learned for the core objects and make it available to CIDs in some way. And that's why I 100% agree with what Rob said here. This is a good timeline. Like the processes you've got here, Rob, makes sense. But I think that exactly what you put here is going to be a bit unclear until Rob's written the thing that explains what do we mean by like an experimental field track, because it's pretty nuanced, and the nuance is actually really important. So what I'm saying is don't be too scared as an implementer yet. The point of this gap is to get everybody clear who needs to implement this, what we're going to have to do as implementers to support like these sort of different tracks of object, and make sure that we all agree that it's a good idea to do it that way and that we can't see any problems. But like this sort of plan that Rob is doing is 100% dependent on that everybody understanding and agreeing to something like that, so that we can add new features in at like an experimental level without messing with the actual GNs of the underlying objects.
Yep.
That was a lot of talking to say the same thing that Rob did, but I think it's an important thing to call out.
I was just trying to get clarity on that. Our thinking, collective thinking, if you will, is that these things would be experimental in the beta, the three things we've got listed here. But the intent would be that we'd take them to, they'd be part of the standard when we go to the V1 GA.
Yeah,
So,
I think so. I think this is a good reminder that I need to translate a doc into a gap. But I think every individual feature, similar to Kubernetes upstream, would have its own graduation criteria, right? So, there's no way to guarantee that all three features will go directly to GA. But I think the general idea is that we have usage of this experimental feature, the feedback is good, and we're comfortable with taking it from experimental to beta or GA, whatever version of the API is at that point. And Nick, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I think the thing that you alluded to there that's really important to call out is that part of having this experimental train is that the graduation status for a particular feature may not be related to you don't have to graduate a feature along an API version boundary. So up till now, in order to graduate, to move a feature from like alpha to beta or non-experimental, that has been done when we move from V1 alpha 1 to V1 alpha 2. But what we're talking about here is that we'll have a V1 beta 1 that will have a certain set of features GA to start with. Then at some point, we'll be able to migrate, say, path redirects into the GA V1 beta 1 object without making it V1 beta 2. And without changing the GVK of the object, there will be a new field just appear.
Okay.
And so that I guess the thing that I'm trying to say is that part of what we're trying to do with this whole discussion is make it so that features being added doesn't require a rev of the GVK, and that's the key part. So we're breaking apart that linkage between features being added and revving the sort of the whole object.
Yeah, right. I got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Cool.
I think thank you for asking the question, because that is really, really important key part of that's the entire point of what Rob is talking about. But it's a really subtle point that is really easy to miss.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I appreciate it, and a good reminder. I need to work on a gap or two now. So yeah, thank you. So with all that said, we had agreed to in the CAP itself, and as we moved to Kubernetes API group, became an official Kubernetes API, we agreed to a few points of beta graduation criteria. I tried to sketch out a rough idea of when we could, ideally have these complete by. I'm open to feedback on each of these dates, but I was just trying to sketch out a timeline of when I thought these things were possible. First off, the V1 Alpha 2 APIs are implemented by several implementations. I think saying that's going to happen in mid-November seems pretty safe, maybe the safest of all of these, because I think we have at least 5 implementations that have a timeline in that range, planning V1 Alpha 2 support. So if 3 of those get in, I think we've met several. So I feel like mid-November seems likely for this part of the graduation criteria to be true. The next one, validating webhook for advanced validation. We already have a webhook. It is close to complete. Harry, I noticed you added an issue that has been in the back of my mind that, we don't have good release machinery around this right now. So we don't have anything that's auto going to publish a versioned tag with a specific image when we do a release. There's some cleanup that's needed here, and cleanup testing, etc. It's largely in place. We just need some fit and finish and deploy help. And I'm not sure what else, but this is just an area that needs someone to look into, but I feel like it's possible by mid-November as well. 3, this is harder to define, but what we have said in graduation criteria is that we have at least some conformance tests in place. This is not asking for a complete conformance test suite. It's just saying the initial conformance tests are in place. So we're having a lot of discussion around that now. This may be a little too optimistic, but it would be awesome if a month from now we had some conformance tests merged in. Not everything, but at least some. Then, let's move back to sometime early in December. Users of the API are exercising most of the API service. If at that point we've had implementations out of V1 Alpha 2 for around a month, it seems likely, though not inevitable, that we'll have some feedback and users of the API will actually be exercising a good chunk of the API surface. And the last one is obviously the hardest to predict, but that's getting approval from not just ourselves, the sub-project owners, but also CAP reviewers, the SIG network reviewers that helped us the last time around. So I put that, maybe this is optimistic, but I put that as early January. So this is, a rough timeline of how we could potentially get to a beta release. Any questions, comments, thoughts on any of these items here? Anything look wildly unreasonable?
On 2, I mean, we have validation for we have a couple of cases of validation. Is it okay to term that as advanced?
That's a good question. I don't know what else we need or could want in validation, but I hadn't thought about that aspect of that.
So this is one area where we haven't kept track of, but there are a lot of review comments where, oh, we should do this in validation webhook. We should check this in validation. We say that, but then we haven't always created an issue to track that, right? And so there are a lot of area there are at least some areas where we have okay, you probably need a validation webhook for a better experience, where you have a field dependent on a third field, and that's not set and things like that. So that requires again some, I think, going back and creating issues. But I'm not saying that we should do all of that before calling it this number 2 done, but I don't know where to draw the line right now. I think we just need to be a little more careful with that.
I think that's a really important one to call out, because of all the things in a beta release, validation is one that's very important to get right, because as we all know, it's very hard to make validation stricter in the future. So I
was gonna say, I think that regardless of where we draw the line on the actual validation, we need to do the fit and finishes, as Rob said, work to actually make it so that it's easy to deploy that. And we need to make sure that we mark out that as part of the conformance you end up doing, you're going to have to be running the validating webhook. Like we haven't called that out anywhere right now, but we need to make sure that is called out, that every time you install a Gateway API implementation, it is expected that you also have the validating webhook for the Gateway API installed. For the Gateway objects. And so
Cool.
we got to have container images published somewhere that you can, and a manifest and all that sort of stuff there that you can just do. I think in terms of the timelines, I think they are pretty optimistic, especially given that y'all are about to move into Thanksgiving / holiday season, and so I would expect bandwidth to be at maximum 60% for this entire period. So between people being away and whatever. So I think having a date is good. I would be pretty surprised if we met all these dates.
Just to point out, mid-November is like 2 weeks away.
No, it's like three weeks. But yes.
What is it?
I know that's a huge difference.
It's like Tuesday for me or something. Like the week's already over by Tuesday. I'm done.
Yeah. I would agree. These are optimistic timelines. I'm just trying to go forward with a vision that is on the optimistic side, because I would like to get a beta out, but I do recognize these are optimistic dates.
Shoot for the stars and you may get to the moon.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, I think more of it.
Yeah. I think more realistically, like that I would kind of expect that the sequence will be the same. Things might take a little longer, but sort of late January, early Feb, I'd be pretty surprised if we couldn't be at number 5.
Yeah.
So another thing that I think the point I'm going to bring up lies both in this document and the last document that we discussed is there are things like reference policy that's easier to test for. That's a core resource, but there are things like the policy mechanism that we have. We don't have any resources, but we do say implementers should, right? We could get around, I don't know how much, what's the right word? How much conformance or how much policing should we be doing that? I don't know the right way to put it. But at least reference policy is something that we need to be careful with. I think that because that's a new concept, right? Like routes and stuff, we can probably be more confident with, I think. But that's one area where we probably categorically need more feedback, because that's new. And that's also like security, right? So be more careful.
Yeah, good point.
Great. Yeah, I think the reference policy, I love the idea, but that one seems like a very early candidate for conformance testing. It's reasonably clear to define as well. Like the tests are actually pretty easy to define. That especially because they're relatively black box kind of tests. When you create things like this, it shouldn't work, and if it does, fail. It's pretty easy tests to make. So I think the key part about the thing that I think is really important for the initial conformance test in place, in order for initial conformance test to be in place, we have to have picked a testing framework and picked a way that you run the tests, and done all of that work and sort of defined the harness and framework bits, which actually I think is maybe a bit more, a little bit more work than it might seem, based on how hard it's been to do that sort of stuff for Contour.
Yes.
Yeah. So I absolutely have, when I've talked to with the Contour team about the conformance test, they were like, oh, we've got a bunch of end-to-end tests that do that sort of thing already. So we should definitely make sure I'm sure everybody has end-to-end tests. And so we should make sure that ideally you should be able to retire a bunch of the tests the individual tests that you're doing in favor of the conformance test for the Gateway API eventually. And probably you want to make the tests for the Gateway API be able to test other things as well, like ingress, and so that you're only running one test harness. And then you can, and then if you can make it so that you can extend it to say custom CIDs or something like that, then that covers a lot of people as well. Like it covers me. So that means that Contour can be like, well, we're going to run the upstream conformance tests, but then we're going to add this one to use that framework to do the HTTP proxy ones, right? And that having this suite of conformance tests is like a de facto like standard ingress controller test as well, because with the stuff you're going to be exercising in Gateway is the same stuff that you would configure in any other method that you were configuring ingress traffic to your cluster.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I know we're past time, so I gotta cut it here. But yes. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Jeff.
I was just going to say I think the timeline is fine. I think it is aggressive, but it's good to have. And I was going to point out the time. So.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. Well, sounds good. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. And we'll talk to you next week.
Yep.
Have a good one.
Yep.
Bye.